"Mom, eat this special bowl of oatmeal. I made it just for you." I was standing in the kitchen holding a cup of tea that had already gone cold. Through the fogged glass, I watched my son lean in and quietly slip something into my wife's bowl of oatmeal. Strangely enough, I didn't shout. I didn't rush over. I just waited. And when my daughter-in-law came back to the table, I calmly switched the bowls. But before I go on, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening to this story from. Now, let me take you back to that morning. I still remember that day clearly. A light rain fell, steady and cold, as if the house itself was breathing out a tiredness that had been building for months. After switching the bowls, I went back to my old spot and sat down on the wooden chair by the window. No one noticed anything unusual. At least, that's what they believed. Eleanor leaned back in her armchair, a thin blanket resting across her knees. She had grown much thinner over the past few months. Not the natural thinning of age, but a slow, quiet wearing down. Every morning she ate a little less, spoke a little less, and looked at me with an apologetic gaze, as if her weakness were somehow her own fault. Caleb stood by the dining table, one hand resting on the back of Brooke's chair. He always held that pose whenever he was near his wife. A habit learned and practiced meant to make him look like a protective man. But I noticed his hand never actually touched Brooke. It hovered close. Always a small gap. Just enough to pull away instantly if needed. "I cooked it thinner than yesterday," Caleb said, his voice calm and even. "The doctor said Mom needs to eat enough to regain her strength." Which doctor, I wondered. For the past 4 months, I had been the one driving Eleanor to her appointments. I was the one sitting in the waiting rooms, listening to every cautious conclusion, every uncertain shake of the head. Not one of them had ever said her condition would decline this quickly. Brooke pulled out her chair and sat down, carefully adjusting the cuff of her blouse. She always dressed neatly in the mornings, even at home, as if she were always ready to step outside, always ready to be seen. On the table, her bowl of oatmeal looked exactly like Eleanor's. Same color, same smell, same gentle warmth rising into the air. I lifted my teacup and took a small sip. The tea tasted weak. I didn't add more water. I wanted to keep that feeling. The sense of something being insufficient, unfinished. The same way everything in this house now felt. In my mind, old memories began to settle into place. Slowly, without any need to rush. Caleb and Brooke moved in 4 months ago, right around the time Eleanor started feeling more exhausted after a mild cold. They said they wanted to take care of us. They said a house this big shouldn't be left to 2 elderly people alone. I didn't object, partly because Eleanor smiled when she heard our son say those words, partly because I believed I understood my son well enough. But from the day they arrived, things changed, in very small ways. Eleanor's meal schedule was arranged by Brooke. Her medications were reviewed. Medical appointments were suggested to be postponed or switched to different doctors. And Caleb, who used to rarely step into the kitchen, suddenly showed an unusual level of concern for every meal his mother ate. I said nothing. I watched. I noticed Eleanor was often more tired after breakfast. I noticed the light spells of dizziness came without any clear pattern. And I noticed that whenever I offered to prepare my wife's food myself, Brooke always had a polite reason to refuse. "Dad, you should rest," she would say. "Let me handle it. I'm used to this. Used to what I once wondered." But I never asked out loud. That morning when I saw Caleb lean in and make a movement so small that without paying attention, one might think it was nothing more than clumsiness, everything inside me went still. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was a familiar feeling, the kind a man gets after living many years alongside hidden truths. I didn't need to know exactly what it was. I only needed to know one thing. It didn't belong in that bowl of oatmeal. After I switched the bowls, time seemed to slow down. Eleanor ate very little as usual. Brooke ate more than she normally did. She talked while eating, chatting about an upcoming appointment, her tone relaxed. Her eyes drifted toward me once or twice, then quickly moved away. Caleb barely touched his own bowl. He watched Brooke more than he watched his mother. His eyes couldn't hide the tense anticipation, even as his mouth kept that familiar, gentle smile. I set my teacup down and folded my hands together. Inside me, a decision had already been made, before I ever found the words for it. If they thought I was just an old man sitting quietly in the corner of the house, then they were mistaken. I didn't need to rush. I only needed enough patience to see how far they would go, and who would be the first to buckle under the weight of the plan they had built themselves. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside this kitchen, the silence was so complete I could hear every person breathing, and I knew the concern they were showing was not what frightened me most. What frightened me was my own calm. That calm didn't come from courage. It came from experience. When you've lived long enough with things left unsaid, you learn to wait instead of reacting. After breakfast, Brooke cleared the table as usual. She did it neatly, almost leaving no trace behind. Caleb made an excuse to go out to the garage to check the car. Eleanor was helped back to her room, each step slow, as if every movement had to ask permission from her own body. I didn't follow anyone. I stayed in the dining room a little longer, looking at the old wooden table that had witnessed 3 generations of this family. On its surface, the faint rings left by hot cups were still there. They never really disappear. They just fade with time. I thought of Eleanor, and wondered how many marks inside her had been dismissed as natural as just age. That afternoon, when the house grew quiet, I went up to my old study, a small room at the end of the hallway, locked ever since I retired. Brooke had asked me a few times about the filing cabinet inside. I told her they were old papers, nothing important. She smiled, and didn't ask again. I opened the cabinet. The folders were still there, arranged the way I always kept them. I didn't need to review everything. I only pulled out what had raised my suspicions weeks earlier. Caleb's credit card statements. Large expenses scattered, but frequent. Cash withdrawals with no clear purpose. And then, a copy of an insurance policy Brooke had forgotten on my desk one afternoon. I remembered that day clearly. She said it was just standard consultation paperwork, nothing I needed to worry about. $3 million. Not a large amount for people in big cities. But for a family like ours, it was an entire future already priced. I sat down and turned the pages slowly. Eleanor's name was there, and her shaky signature, one I recognized immediately. When she signed it and under what circumstances, I didn't need to ask anymore. I knew Brooke was very good with words. She knew how to turn complicated language into gentle reassurance. That evening, Caleb came home earlier than usual. He went straight into the living room, saying he needed to grab some papers from the car. I stood on the stairs and looked down, and noticed he was carrying the old dash camera he once bragged about using to record family trips. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I went down to the garage. I didn't turn on the main light. I used only a small desk lamp I brought with me. Caleb never changed the camera's password. He was never careful with things he believed were harmless. I didn't watch everything. I fast-forwarded looking for clips where the audio was clearer than the video. And then I heard Brooke's voice, cold, precise. Nothing like her gentle daytime tone. "Is that dosage enough?" she asked. Caleb was silent for a few seconds. "I think it's fine. But if nothing happens, we increase it a little. No names, no explanations, just short sentences, as if they were discussing a change in a meal plan." I turned the device off and put everything back exactly where it was. On my way upstairs, I stopped outside Eleanor's door. The nightlight spilled through the crack. I heard her breathing, slow, steady, tired. I didn't wake her. Not yet. The next morning, breakfast went on as usual. The same table. The same familiar smell of oatmeal. Brooke sat down and lifted her spoon before Eleanor did. I noticed her hand trembled slightly. Just a little. It could have been fatigue, or a feeling she hadn't yet found a name for. I sat across from them watching quietly. Caleb barely took his eyes off Brooke. The anticipation in his gaze was no longer carefully hidden like the day before. He wasn't playing the devoted son anymore. He was just someone counting time. Brooke brought the spoon to her mouth. I saw the exact moment her expression changed. Not much. Just a quick frown, quickly masked by a strained smile. "The oatmeal today tastes different," she said, trying to sound normal. Caleb turned to her. "Different how I don't know," Brooke replied, setting the spoon down. "There's something bitter at the end." I took a sip of my tea, the same weak taste as always. Inside me, my heartbeat didn't change. I felt no satisfaction, only a sharper clarity that the shell they had worked so hard to build was beginning to crack. And once those cracks appear, the question is no longer whether the truth will come out. Only when. Those cracks didn't take long to spread. Just 15 minutes later, Brooke began to change. At first, it was a very small restlessness. She kept shifting in her chair, placing a hand on her chest, then dropping it again, as if she didn't know where to keep her hands. Caleb noticed before I did. He leaned toward his wife and whispered something. Brooke shook her head and tried to smile, but the smile couldn't hold. The air in the dining room grew thick. Eleanor looked up at her daughter-in-law, her eyes tired, but still clear enough to sense that something was wrong. She was about to ask, but Brooke suddenly stood up, the chair scraping sharply against the wooden floor. I don't feel well, Brooke said, her breath short. It's probably just fatigue. Caleb reached out to steady her, but Brooke pushed his hand away. She took 2 steps, then stopped gripping the edge of the table. Her face drained of color quickly, as if it were being pulled straight from her skin. I remained seated. I didn't need to stand to see what was happening. Caleb turned to me. For the first time that morning, he couldn't keep the calm in his eyes. Dad, do you see anything wrong? I set my teacup down carefully. You should ask your wife, I said. My voice wasn't raised. It wasn't lowered either. It was simply the right answer in the right place. Brooke's breathing grew faster. She lifted a hand to her throat as if the room had suddenly run out of air. Eleanor rose in alarm, but I motioned for her to sit back down. She looked at me full of questions. I shook my head gently. Not yet. Caleb hesitated. He looked at Brooke, then at me, then toward the door. We should call for help, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He knew I was waiting for something, and he knew he couldn't leave this room without giving an answer. Brooke slid back into the chair, sweat forming on her forehead. She tried to say something, but the words broke apart halfway through. Then, as if she no longer had the strength to hold it in, she looked up at Caleb, panic and anger colliding in her eyes. You told me it wouldn't have a smell, she blurted out. You said it was safe. The room fell silent, a heavy silence, thick enough for every word to hang in the air. Caleb went pale. What are you talking about? He whispered, but it was already too late to pretend he didn't understand. Brooke laughed, a crooked, uncontrolled laugh. You said we just had to wait a little longer. You said it would all end cleanly, and now, she stopped gasping. You're going to let me sit here like this? I stood up. No rush, no noise. I walked to the dining room door and closed it. The sound of the lock was soft, but clear enough for everyone to hear. What are you doing, Dad? Caleb asked, his voice sharper than before. I returned to the table and placed a stack of papers in the center. Those pages had been sitting in my drawer for weeks. I was only choosing the right moment to bring them into the light. We're going to talk, I said. Right now. Brooke stared at the papers, her eyes unsteady. She understood what words like those could do. Caleb didn't look at them. He looked at me, and for the first time he no longer saw an old man. In here, I continued, are the things you both thought I'd never put together. The debts, the conversations, and the thing you like to call the dosage. Eleanor stood again slowly. She came to my side, her hand trembling. Harlan, she said softly. I placed my hand over hers. I know, I said. I've known for a long time. Brooke began to shake harder. She looked around as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. What do you want? She asked, her voice breaking. I want the truth, I answered. Not to punish, but to end this. Caleb lowered his head. His shoulders sagged, as if the final weight had finally been set where it belonged. I didn't have a choice, he said. It all went out of control. When did it start? I asked. He stayed silent. Brooke let out a weak laugh. From the moment he decided everything could be solved by closing the door on someone else, she said. I reached into my jacket and took out a small vial. None of them knew what it was. I placed it on the table well out of Brooke's reach. This isn't what you think, I said, but it's enough to stop what's happening. Caleb looked up. You were prepared. I prepared myself to face my own son, I replied. That's far more difficult. Brooke closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them, the sharpness was gone. Only exhaustion and fear remained. I'll talk, she whispered. But after that, this won't stay a secret. I nodded. It stopped being a secret the moment you both believed I couldn't see. Outside, the rain had stopped. But inside this room, the real nightmare was only just beginning to show itself. Brooke began to speak slowly, as if every sentence had to be pulled up from somewhere very deep. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Caleb either. Her eyes stayed fixed on the edge of the table, where the paint had peeled away long ago. We didn't mean for things to get this messy, she said. At first it was just buying time, waiting for things to sort themselves out. Caleb collapsed into his chair. He buried his head in his hands. From that position he looked much smaller than the man he had been trying to appear as for months. Debt isn't a small thing, he said, his voice rough. Not like anything you've dealt with before, Dad. They don't wait. They don't negotiate. I didn't interrupt. I let them talk. Once people start speaking, the hardest part isn't forcing the truth out of them. It's not stepping in to soften it. Brooke continued, her voice steadier now. Caleb thought that with the insurance money, everything would be over. We could sell this house, pay off the debts, and start over somewhere else. Start over, I repeated. Without your mother in it. She went quiet. Caleb looked up, then looked away. The answer was right there, in that avoidance. I've worked with insurance files before, Brooke went on, almost like she was reading from a report. I know how things work. I know which details don't get questioned. Eleanor trembled slightly beside me. I tightened my grip on her hand. I didn't look at her. If I did, I knew I wouldn't keep my voice as steady as it was now. And this I asked, nudging the stack of papers toward them. Last year? Caleb flinched. Dad, what do you know? I know enough to understand why my own health declined for a short time, I said. And I know enough to recognize that it wasn't random. Brooke snapped her head toward Caleb. The fear in her eyes was gone, replaced by anger. You didn't tell him, she demanded. You said it was taken care of. Caleb shot to his feet. Stop it, he snapped, then realized his voice was too loud. He lowered it. Not now. No, Brooke said. Now is exactly the time. She turned to me. You want the truth, don't you? Then listen carefully. I didn't come up with that idea. I just helped him find a way. He's the one who said his father wouldn't notice. That you were old. The words dropped into the room like a heavy object. Caleb stepped back as if he'd been shoved. What are you saying? He whispered. I'm saying you're used to people trusting you, Brooke replied, and you took advantage of that. I looked at my son. For the first time, I wasn't searching for excuses for him. I was simply looking as if at a stranger stepping out of the dark. Just then, there was a steady knock on the dining room door. Not urgent, not rushed. As if whoever stood outside already knew the door would open. Eleanor stepped forward. From the pocket of her cardigan, she took out a small recorder and placed it on the table. Go on, she said. Her voice was weak but clear. Everything is being recorded. Caleb spun toward her. Mom, weren't you supposed to be resting? I've rested enough, Eleanor said, and I've heard enough. Brooke closed her eyes. She knew the game was over, not because of me, but because the person she believed to be the weakest in this house had stood up. The knock came again, closer this time. I went to the door and opened it. 2 uniformed figures stood outside, calm and composed. I nodded and stepped aside. Caleb panicked. When did you call them before? You thought you still had time, I said. One of them entered, scanned the room, then looked at the papers, the recorder, and the faces that could no longer hide anything. Caleb turned to Brooke, his voice breaking. You said everything would be fine. Brooke laughed. A short, bitter sound. You never listened when I said what fine really meant. Caleb turned to me, grasping for something. Dad, I just need one chance. I looked at him for a long time. You had many chances, I said. You just didn't use them to protect your family. Eleanor stood beside me, her back straighter than it had been that morning. She didn't cry. She simply looked at her son, like someone watching a door close for good. When they were led away, I didn't follow. I stayed in the dining room where everything had begun. On the table, the bowl of oatmeal had long since gone cold. I knew that from this moment on, nothing would ever return to the way it was. But sometimes closing a door isn't about ending something. It's about making sure the darkness never comes back in. The house grew quiet very quickly after they were gone. Not the comforting kind of quiet, but the silence that settles after a storm passes, when everything is still standing, yet nothing is in quite the same place. Eleanor lowered herself into her familiar armchair. Her breathing slowed, deep and steady, as if she had finally set down a weight she'd been carrying for far too long. I stood by the window, watching the rain fade completely. The pale afternoon light spilled into the yard, brushing against the worn walls of this old house. I realized I no longer felt angry, only tired. The days that followed passed quietly. Everything was handled the way it needed to be, step by step, without haste. Eleanor and I didn't talk much about what had happened. We didn't need to. Some things once exposed are best left resting in the light without further explanation. One morning as we sat eating together, Eleanor placed her hand over mine. We can't stay here anymore, she said softly. It wasn't a suggestion, just a truth spoken out loud. I nodded. I'd been thinking the same thing for a long time. This house held too many memories, both the good ones and those no longer meant to be carried. We began sorting through it room by room. No rush, no regret, just choosing what needed to come with us. When I closed the door to my old study for the last time, I didn't lock it. I left it open. A small habit. A reminder that the past doesn't need to be sealed away. It just shouldn't be allowed to control the present. The estate was transferred quietly. No gatherings. No loud goodbyes. The money we received was enough to begin something we had both thought about for years, but never said out loud. We set up a small fund. No big name. No polished slogans. Just a place where older people, those who once believed family was the safest place of all, could find support when that trust was broken. Eleanor was more involved than I was. She listened. I handled the paperwork. Each of us in our role, the same way we'd lived together for decades. Our new home sits near the sea. Not large, not fancy. But every morning when I open the window, I can hear the waves. Steady, patient. Eleanor likes to brew mint tea. The scent drifts gently through the small, clean kitchen. No more oatmeal. No more tense mornings. One afternoon, Eleanor sat on the balcony, sunlight catching in her hair now more silver than before. She smiled at me, a light smile, unforced. "I feel better," she said. I believed her. Not because of numbers or reassurances, but because her eyes had returned to where they belonged. I sat beside her, holding a cup of steaming tea. I thought about family, about what people often call obligation. I used to believe blood was something that could never be cut away. But now I understand this family is not a bond that demands suffering at any cost. Family is what protects us when we are at our weakest, and when that protection is gone, walking away is not betrayal, it is survival. We didn't try to forget. We simply chose not to live inside that pain every day. Some chapters in life need to be closed, not to erase them, but to let the heart breathe again. That evening the sea breeze was cool and gentle. Eleanor rested her hand on mine. "At last, we're at peace," she said. I looked out toward the horizon where the sky darkened into night. I nodded. This time I wasn't waiting anymore. I knew. Peace doesn't come from holding on to everything. It comes from knowing when to let go. If you stayed with me until this moment, thank you for listening to my story. If it gave you something to think about, please like and share it so it can reach those who need to be heard. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future family stories. The message I want to leave you with is simple. Family is not a place where we endure in silence. It's a place where we are protected when we're most vulnerable. And sometimes the hardest choice, to walk away quietly, is the only way to preserve the last good part of who we are. Thank you for listening.